Before it was a state, before it was a purchase, before it even had borders, it was simply called Alyeska, the Great Land. But who gave it that name? And why does a word whispered by ancient Arctic peoples still echo across the cold winds of America's last frontier, Alaska? A land of brutal beauty, vast silence, and raw wilderness. The name conjures images of solitude, survival, and strength. But behind that name lies a collision of cultures, from native tongues shaped by glaciers and stars, to imperial ambitions carved in ink by European empires. This is not just a name. It's a story, of language, of conquest, and of resilience. The original name, Alyeska. Long before it was known as Alaska, before the stars and stripes were raised, before the Russians even dreamed of distant riches, there was only Alyeska. This word, softly carried on Arctic winds, came from the indigenous peoples who lived in deep communion with the land for millennia. To them, it wasn't just land, it wasn't territory, it wasn't property, it was spirit, it was survival, it was home. Alyeska, in the language of the Aleut and Suppiaq peoples, branches of the Eskimo Aleut language family, roughly translates to the Great Land. But that simple English version barely scratches the surface. In its full meaning, Alyeska implied a presence so vast and sacred it could not be owned. It was the place toward which the action of the sea is directed, a phrase that reflected how the land, the ocean, and the people were all interconnected. To the Anangiks, Alutiiq, Yupik, Iñupiat, and other indigenous communities of the region, names weren't just labels, they were living truths. In their worldview, to name a place was to recognize its spirit. To speak the land's name was to enter into relationship with it. You didn't own it, you belonged to it. In this ancient relationship, the land provided everything: food, shelter, wisdom, ceremony. But it also demanded humility. Survival in Alyeska required listening to the rhythms of nature, knowing the winds, the migrations, the ice. It meant offering gratitude after a hunt, not out of superstition, but respect. The original name, passed down orally for generations, was not written. It didn't need to be. It was sung in ceremonial chants, spoken around fires, taught to children with each story about glaciers and stars. It shaped identities. One's sense of self came from knowing the land intimately, its rivers, its storms, its silence. Language played a crucial role. The Eskimo Aleut languages, unlike English, often prioritize verbs over nouns. The focus is on movement, transformation, and action, mirroring the ever-shifting conditions of Arctic life. So when these communities described Alyeska, they weren't just talking about a place. They were talking about an active, breathing force. A world in motion. Even the term, great, didn't mean powerful in a political sense. It meant expansive, mysterious, sacred. It meant that the land was beyond the grasp of human control. And yet, paradoxically, it held the people in its embrace. This worldview stood in stark contrast to the colonial ideologies that would later arrive. Empires drew borders, they signed deeds. They measured wealth in acreage and resource extraction. But for the original inhabitants of Alyeska, value wasn't found in what the land could be sold for, but in what it gave freely, if treated with reverence. And though maps would later rename the land Alaska, a Russian mispronunciation filtered into English, the original spirit of Alyeska never vanished. Even as languages were suppressed, villages displaced, and sacred grounds paved over, the memory of the Great Land remained embedded in story, in practice, and in the hearts of the people who never left. Today, indigenous voices are rising again. Elders teach younger generations the original words. Ceremonies once banned are being revived. Language programs are restoring what assimilation tried to erase. And through it all, Alyeska, the Great Land, endures. It endures not just as a name, but as a philosophy. A reminder that some places can't be fully explained, only experienced. That land is not just earth and stone, but history, spirit, and kinship. To call it Alyeska is to remember. To speak its name is to honor the first ones who knew its heart. And to understand its meaning is to see the land not as something beneath us, but something we belong to. Russian intervention and imperial influence, By the mid-18th century, the world beyond Alyeska had begun to stir with curiosity. Whispers of a remote, untouched land, brimming with furs, fisheries, and untapped resources, had reached the ears of empire. The Russian Empire, driven by hunger for wealth and prestige, turned its gaze eastward, across Siberia, across the Bering Sea, and into the ancestral heartland of indigenous peoples who had never drawn a single border. In 1741, Vitus Bering, a Danish explorer commissioned by the Russian Navy, landed on the southern coast of Alaska. His fateful expedition, carried out under imperial command, was not just an exploratory feat, it was the beginning of colonization. The Russians saw in Alyeska what every empire sees in land it does not understand: opportunity. They weren't alone. Britain and Spain were also mapping the Pacific Northwest, racing to claim territory. But Russia moved quickly and aggressively, seeking to monopolize the riches of the fur trade, especially the coveted sea otter pelts that fetched astronomical prices in China. What followed was a wave of fur traders and fortune seekers known as promyshleniki, Russian frontiersmen backed by czars and protected by muskets. They came not to coexist, but to extract. They established outposts, trade routes, and even Russian Orthodox missions throughout the coastal regions. Entire native communities were conscripted into the fur trade, sometimes forcibly. Women were taken, traditions were disrupted, and violence was not uncommon. The empire had arrived, not with treaties, but with commerce and conquest. But with colonization came something else: linguistic dominance. Russian cartographers and missionaries, unfamiliar with indigenous sounds and uninterested in preserving native accuracy, struggled to pronounce the name Alyeska. So they simplified it, flattened it, rewrote it. Alyeska became Alaska, a colonial approximation. A compromise between their tongue and the land's truth. This wasn't merely a translation. It was a transformation. Once written in Russian Cyrillic, the altered name made its way into legal documents, shipping logs, maps, and letters to St. Petersburg. The mispronunciation, Alaska, soon became the official name of an unofficial colony. This linguistic erasure reflected a broader reality. The Russian Empire didn't just want furs or outposts, they wanted identity, ownership, dominion. Renaming the land was a symbolic act of possession, a way to reshape something ancient into something imperial. Yet even as the Russians carved their mark into the coastlines, they never truly tamed Alyeska. The interior remained vast, impenetrable, and fiercely indigenous. Russian influence, while lasting, was concentrated and thin. And unlike other imperial colonies, Russia's tenure in Alaska was relatively short, less than 130 years. Still, the legacy remains. Orthodox churches with onion domes still stand in native villages. Russian surnames appear in Alaska's phone books. Cultural remnants like iconography, music, and religion linger, blended now with native customs in a unique fusion of worlds that once collided. But for all that Russia attempted to inscribe on Alyeska, it could never erase its spirit. The name, Alaska, may dominate on paper, but it is still haunted by the syllables of its origin. A reminder that this land was known long before any empire came looking. And in the end, Russia would walk away, not because the land lacked value, but because the empire was crumbling under its own weight. The colony that once promised fortune became too difficult to govern, too far to defend, and too wild to tame. But it left something behind. A name, misheard, mistranslated, but never truly claimed. A legacy of conquest, yes. But also a thread in the larger tapestry of a land whose story cannot be silenced by empire. For even as Russia's influence faded, the echoes of Alyeska remained, resilient, ancient, and waiting to be remembered. The Alaska Purchase, Seward's Folly. In the waning decades of the 19th century, the Russian Empire found itself burdened by a distant possession it could no longer afford to manage. Alaska, remote, frigid, and largely unprofitable, had lost its luster. The once lucrative fur trade had collapsed under the weight of overhunting and market shifts. Maintaining the colony was expensive, vulnerable to British invasion from neighboring Canada, and far removed from the empire's priorities in Europe. So, in a quiet but consequential decision, Russia offered to sell the land. The offer reached William H. Seward, U.S. Secretary of State under President Andrew Johnson. Seward was no stranger to controversy. He was an expansionist, an idealist who envisioned the United States stretching its influence across oceans. He believed in manifest destiny not just across the continent, but around the globe. And to him, Alaska wasn't an icy wasteland, it was a golden opportunity. After months of negotiation, the deal was struck. On March 30, 1867, the United States agreed to purchase Alaska for $7.2 million, a sum that equated to just over 2 cents per acre. For a landmass nearly 1/5 the size of the contiguous U.S., it was a bargain by any modern standard. But America didn't see it that way, at least, not at first. The press erupted in ridicule, political cartoons mocked Seward. Newspapers called the deal Seward's Folly, Seward's Icebox, and even Polar Bear Garden. To a war-weary nation still recovering from the Civil War, the idea of purchasing a frozen wilderness seemed absurd. What use was a land covered in ice and darkness? Why spend millions on a region filled with more moose than men? The general public saw Alaska as a national joke. And yet, while critics laughed, Seward remained steadfast. He believed Alaska held strategic importance, bordering both the Pacific and the Arctic, and offering a stepping stone to Asia. He predicted that it would one day be rich in minerals, timber, and fisheries. He was right. On October 18, 1867, in the town of Sitka, the transfer became official. In a brief and ceremonial act, Russian troops lowered their flag, and American soldiers raised the stars and stripes. A cannon salute marked the transition. And just like that, a sacred land changed hands, sold from one empire to another, without a single indigenous voice consulted. For Native Alaskans, this moment wasn't liberation. It was another layer of colonization. The people who had called this land home for over 10,000 years were not only left out of the conversation, they were reclassified as subjects under a new flag, governed by laws they didn't write, and surrounded by settlers who didn't understand them. The early years of American control were chaotic. The military ruled with little oversight. Lawlessness ran wild. Economic development was slow. But beneath the surface, the land's value was beginning to reveal itself. By the 1890s, gold was discovered. Prospectors flooded the territory. Then came timber, salmon, and eventually oil, vast reserves of it, lying dormant beneath frozen ground for centuries. What had once been seen as folly transformed into one of the most resource-rich regions in the United States. But Seward's vision came at a cost. The deal had ignored the sovereignty of hundreds of native nations. It had reduced millennia of culture, knowledge, and spiritual relationship with the land to a financial transaction. It set in motion a new era of displacement, cultural suppression, and legal battles over land rights that still continue today. Yet through it all, the spirit of Alyeska endured. Beneath the treaties and transactions, the land remembered. And so did the people. History would eventually vindicate Seward. But the true story of the Alaska Purchase isn't just about diplomacy or strategy. It's about the clash of worldviews, between empires that measured land by its price, and peoples who measured it by its meaning. The spiritual power of the great land. To understand Alaska purely as geography is to miss its soul. To measure it in miles or minerals is to flatten something vast, ancient, and alive. For the indigenous peoples of this land, Alaska is not just a place you live in, it is a sacred presence you live with. Long before borders and names, before it was called Alaska or even Alyeska, the land was known through relationship. The Iñupiat, Yupik, Anangiks, Tlingit, and Alutiiq peoples didn't just dwell in the land, they were part of it. The mountains were not just rocks. The rivers were not just water. The animals were not just resources. All were seen as relatives, each carrying spirit, each worthy of respect. The original name, Alyeska, meaning the great land, wasn't a declaration of ownership or grandeur. It was a recognition of this deep spiritual bond. Great didn't mean powerful in the political sense. It meant expansive, mysterious, sacred. A place too immense to ever fully know, yet intimately familiar to those who listen. In many indigenous worldviews, land is not inanimate. It moves. It remembers. It reacts. The earth is a living being, one with stories, moods, and memory. Certain mountains are believed to be ancestors. Certain caves are gateways. Certain rivers sing. When elders speak of the land, they do so with reverence, like speaking of a respected elder or a beloved grandparent. This reverence shapes daily life. Traditional hunting practices are built on gratitude. Before a seal is taken, it is spoken to. Before a whale is hunted, songs are sung. The act of taking life is always balanced with a ritual of thanks, not out of fear, but from a sacred duty to maintain harmony. To take more than you need is not just wasteful, it is spiritually wrong. Even language itself reflects this connection. Many indigenous Alaskan languages prioritize verbs and action over nouns and objects. Life is described through movement and change, not fixed categories. You don't just fish, you enter into a cycle of exchange with the sea. You don't just walk, you journey with the land. In this way, language isn't just communication, it's a ceremony. Colonial systems tried to erase this. Missionaries labeled these beliefs as superstition. Boarding schools forbade the languages that carried these ideas. Laws criminalized ceremonies, dances, and hunting practices that had been sacred for thousands of years. But the land could not forget. And neither could the people. Today, across Alaska, there is a resurgence. Native communities are reclaiming their ceremonies, reviving their languages, and reteaching traditional practices. Elders are passing on stories that were once whispered in fear. Children are learning the songs that describe how the stars speak to the ocean and how the land dreams through snow. Even institutions have begun to nod, however faintly, to the old name. The Alyeska pipeline, a massive structure built for transporting oil, still carries the original word for the land it crosses. It's a complicated symbol, a blend of extraction and memory, progress and loss. Yet even in that tension, Alyeska survives. The spiritual power of the great land isn't confined to the past. It continues in the quiet, in the breath of the wind, in the footprints of a wolf, in the stories etched into glacier ice and sealskin. To most, Alaska is a frontier. To others, a wilderness. But to those who truly know it, it remains something far deeper, a teacher, an ancestor, a sacred partner. In the end, the great land does not belong to anyone. But we, all of us, still belong to it. Hidden echoes in modern Alaska. Modern Alaska is often described with superlatives. The largest state, the wildest frontier, the coldest extremes. Tourists flock to see glaciers calve into the sea, bears roam through national parks, and the northern lights dance in the sky. But beneath the surface, beyond the mountains and oil fields, beyond the cruise ships and souvenir shops, there are echoes. Quiet, persistent echoes of something older. Something deeper. Something almost forgotten. Those echoes belong to Alyeska. The original name for this land, spoken by indigenous peoples long before Russia, long before America, still whispers beneath the modern identity. And though it rarely appears on official maps or in headlines, Alyeska lives on. In the language, in the land, and in the people who never stopped calling it home. You can hear it in the voices of native elders, who still tell stories about the time when animals and humans spoke the same language. You can see it in the ceremonies returning to tribal halls, once outlawed and driven underground. And you can feel it in the slow, determined revival of indigenous languages once nearly silenced by government boarding schools. Across Alaska today, 229 federally recognized tribes are actively reclaiming what centuries of colonization tried to erase. Schools are teaching Yupik, Tlingit, Inupiaq, and other native languages to younger generations. Cultural camps are guiding youth through traditional practices, hunting, fishing, carving, singing, so they can relearn how to live with the land, not just on it. Yet these echoes of Alyeska do not come without contradiction. Modern Alaska is shaped by industries, oil, mining, commercial fishing, and tourism, that have built wealth but also inflicted wounds. Massive pipelines run through ancient migration routes, Remote villages lack basic infrastructure, even as billions are generated from the land beneath them. Climate change is melting the permafrost, threatening entire indigenous communities who are now being forced to relocate, not because of war or politics, but because the earth is literally slipping away. Still, Alyeska endures. Even in Anchorage and Fairbanks, where concrete stretches farther than tundra, indigenous place names are returning to street signs and public spaces. Art installations honor the spirits of the land. Tribal councils are asserting sovereignty. The spiritual rhythm of the land is finding its way back into the conversation. And then there are the symbols that straddle both worlds. Take the Alyeska pipeline, for instance, a steel artery pumping oil through Alaska's vast wilderness. Named after the original word for the land, it is at once a monument to industrial ambition and an accidental homage to the sacred. That name, placed on something so modern, carries a strange duality. A reminder that even systems built to extract from the land cannot fully erase its original identity. Or consider the tourism brochures that brand Alaska as untouched, wild, or unspoiled, unwittingly echoing the indigenous understanding that the land is not a commodity, but a living entity. The truth is, Alaska was never a blank canvas. It was a deeply inhabited, deeply spiritual space. And in the quiet, the land still tells that story. There's a growing awareness, especially among younger generations, that honoring the future of Alaska means acknowledging its past. Not just the past of colonization and purchase, but the original past, the time when the name Alyeska meant more than location. It meant belonging. Because the great land was never lost, its memory was buried, but not broken. Its name was changed, but not erased. Today, the challenge is not to create something new, but to remember what has always been there. Alyeska, the great land, still watching, still waiting, still speaking, for those willing to listen. Names matter. They carry the weight of memory. Alaska is more than a dot on a map. It's a word built by generations, reshaped by empires, and reclaimed by those who never left. In a world moving faster every day, there's something sacred about a place that still holds on to its origin. A place that still whispers, I am Alyeska. I am the great land. If this journey into Alaska's hidden name story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more untold origins from the land beneath your feet, and the names etched into its soul.